So I know that how you got involved had something to do with the cancer anxiety study. Can you tell us a little bit about like what was motivating about that? And did you have any background in like psychology, or why was that striking?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I was actually a student in film school at NYU back in 2011. And I was just kind of looking for like a topic for my senior project film. And I heard somebody talking about this study that was going on at the School of Medicine. And it immediately piqued my interest because at the time I was like really obsessed with the whole counterculture of the 60s. So I sort of loved the music that came out of that era, and figures like Timothy Leary and Ken Kesey and the acid tests. I was just like really obsessed with that period of time. And to me, that's like what psychedelics, that's where it came from. That's what psychedelics mean, was like the counterculture of the 60s. So I was immediately intrigued that they were using it at a major university, and it was like in a DEA, FDA controlled way, even though it's a Schedule I substance. And the idea of using it like therapeutically was very new to me. So that's kind of what like piqued my initial interest. And so what started as what was supposed to be like my senior film that I was going to complete within a year, quickly, grew into something that I ended up working on for many years after that. But it just, once I started looking into the NYU study, I started learning about all this history of psychedelics, and how it was, originally seen as like a very promising tool within psychiatry prior to the 60s. I also learned about, Albert Hoffman and Gordon Wasson and Maria Sabina, all these characters that we saw in the film. And to me, it was just like, it sort of flipped the whole topic on its head for me, and revealed this whole history that I had no idea about. And I felt like our sort of common perception about psychedelics was sort of trapped in the 60s. And that was really just one chapter in a much larger story. So that's really kind of the initial motivation for me.
Awesome. So we have one question so far in the chat, which I'll read. Do we know of any studies using well, first you said excellent work on the film, pardon me for arriving late. Do we know of any studies using whole mushrooms versus manufactured psilocybin? Is there any difference?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. So as far as I'm aware, all the studies that are being done currently are with synthetic psilocybin. And the reason is that is because they have to get the dosage. They have to know the dosage exactly right. And when you're dealing with whole mushrooms, it's much harder to get that dose very specifically. So all the studies like at NYU and Hopkins certainly are with synthetic. And I believe any sort of like above board study would be with the compound psilocybin. And I know I was talking about this, came up with Lawrence Millman, who I met at the Telluride Mushroom Festival. He's a mycologist, and he was going into the whole thing about, well, whole mushrooms are different than psilocybin mushrooms. There's something to the process of holding a whole mushroom. But yeah, as far as I know, it's all synthetic psilocybin.
Great. I had no idea. That makes a lot of sense though.
Yep.
Next question is about the historical footage. So was that kind of easier than you expected to find that stuff, or surprising, or was it harder? Was that part of what played into the time it took to make this film?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so typically when you're working on a documentary, you always look for stuff that's in the public domain. Because otherwise, like any footage you use in the film, you have to license from the copyright holder, so that can get quite expensive. So it's kind of like the first step is always to see, like, is there anything in the public domain? So that was kind of my first step in looking for this like historical footage. And then I was like very pleasantly surprised to learn that there were a handful of films that were made actually by the US government back in that time. So a lot of the stuff that you see, like that one black and white footage where he's giving LSD and he's looking at the rug, that was a government made film actually in the 50s. Yeah, and a lot of another one was like done by the CIA. It was sort of a CIA research movie. Another one was done by the Food and Drug Administration, another from the National Institute on Mental Health. So I was like really pleasantly surprised to find that there was a lot of great footage that was actually made by the US government in the sort of 50s and 60s. And so a big portion of what you see is actually those taken from that material.
Kind of a follow-up question, did that change, like once you started seeing the footage, I mean, as a filmmaker, how did that change your perspective of like how you would tell the story when you were thinking of it initially versus what the images, the sounds, and the reality of the film was?
Yeah, like originally, I thought that the NYU study was going to be like the whole film, and I thought I would just really cover that whole study. Now, as it turned out, part of the reason for that not being the whole film was because I could only interview the participants after the study was completed. That was just like a ground rule that they had, because otherwise they were afraid that if they gave interviews beforehand, it could interfere with the study. So originally I kind of wanted to follow them like from beginning to end through the process before the psilocybin trip, actually see the psilocybin trip, and then their experience afterwards. But they also don't allow cameras inside the room either. So that's part of the reason. But then the other reason is just there was so much rich historical footage, including like from these films that were available in the National Archives, that it just turned out there's so much rich history that I really wanted the bulk of it to be the history as well as the modern.
That's interesting. Didn't think about that, because that would be interesting to follow people from beginning to end, kind of like.
Yep. Yeah, and I know that that's something that other filmmakers have tried to make, like films on this subject have run into, where you kind of want to follow somebody like ideally like right after they've received their cancer diagnosis, and you're sort of like filming them as they're dealing with the anxiety around that, and then the preparation for the session, and then the session itself, and then how they feel afterwards. Ideally, you kind of want to cover that whole arc, but unfortunately, they just don't allow you to follow that process because of it potentially interfering with the study. So, but I'm lucky that I was even able to get those participants, because it's actually quite hard to get permission even to interview the participants.
I imagine. Was there anything during the making of the film that surprised you in particular, or in the reception? So you and I have talked a little bit about how people's openness maybe to this topic has changed over the course of you making it. So either during the making of it, like based on what you were encountering as a filmmaker, or like reaction.
Yeah, and like anything that surprised me, you mean?
I know it's like a big question, but just like kind of turning points that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, one of the earliest pieces for me was when I was interviewing Tony Bossis. He's one of the NYU researchers. He is the first person that mentioned this idea of mystical experience to me. And I had sort of heard that word before, but I didn't really quite know what it meant. And I also, like, I was raised Catholic, and then I became sort of like staunchly atheist for a little while. And so, but he sort of introduced this idea of like mystical experience, and it's kind of the original experience that really a lot of religions are based on. But sometimes maybe that original experience gets a little bit mistranslated over time. And he was saying how in these studies, that's really what they're going after with the participants, is to elicit a mystical experience. And it's really through experiencing that they have this therapeutic outcome, sort of reshaping their look on death, or in other studies dealing with addiction, depression, etc. So that was a huge surprise to me, that this sort of like Schedule 1 substance was linked, scientifically to mystical experience. And so that became a big surprise, and became kind of like a common thread that I used sort of in piecing all these different historical pieces together. So that was a big surprise. And then the other big surprise was, as you were saying, like the reaction to the movie. When I first started in 2011, nobody was talking about psychedelic research. It was really not reported much in the press. And when I would sort of like tell people, no, there's this study going on at NYU and they're helping people who have cancer and it's like reshaping their outlook on life, people really looked at me like I was crazy. And it was really hard to like kind of introduce that subject to the average person. And then just in the time period of making this film and trying to get it out in front of audiences, the public perception has shifted like immensely. And now like everybody is sending me articles from The Economist and Newsweek all about psychedelic research. And a guy named Michael Pollan came out with a book in 2018 called How to Change Your Mind. And that became a bestseller and like really sort of brought the subject to the forefront. And now there's really a booming business too. There's all these publicly traded companies trying to get into the psychedelic wellness space. And there's a lot of sort of contentious issues about that. But that's been a big surprise for me too, just how much, changed just in the process of making the movie.
Wow. We have another question in the chat. Did you consider going to Mexico to shoot interviews or do a deeper dive on the curanderos? I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong. That does seem like the main way many Westerners experience psychedelics. Just curious if that was an option for you during the making of this great film.
Yeah, that's a good question. I was pretty constrained just by like the nature of being an independent filmmaker and really kind of being bootstrapped during the whole process. So I would have loved to like travel around the world and really dive into those indigenous communities and film that. But unfortunately, I was pretty constrained just geographically. And even actually, because I was living in New York for a lot of this, pretty much all the interviews I did were shot in New York. And I would even get experts while they happened to be in New York, just so I wouldn't have to travel to LA or wherever. And then a lot of it was just research and editing at home. So I was pretty constrained by travel, or not really being able to travel, but definitely would have like loved to dive into that. And I sort of have an idea for a next project, which is to take this film but expand it into like a multi-part series, and really so like split it up into hour-long episodes potentially. And I think that first episode would be all about like indigenous use, and I'd love to travel to Mexico and other places to really delve deeper into that.
That makes sense. We have Katie who is raising her hand. Katie, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So one thing that kind of struck me was this idea that a common experience reported when people use psychedelics is this feeling of connectedness or oneness, which to me at least has a really kind of non-hierarchical feel to it. But in the US, at least, people seem to still kind of gravitate towards these Timothy Leary type figures. So I was curious if in your research, if you found any examples like that from other parts of the world where it still became this kind of cult of personality type thing, or if that was a uniquely American take on psychedelics.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. I'm just going to think about it for a second. On the top of my head, it really does seem like a pretty uniquely American phenomenon. And it's sort of like this great irony, which is what Michael Pollan pointed this out in his book, is that the whole point of the psychedelic experience is it dissolves your ego. It like breaks down your sense of self and sort of how you see yourself as separate from other people and the world. But at the same time, it seems to strengthen the ego of like certain leaders within the space, where they sort of start to feel like they're a prophet and they've been like sent on earth to deliver this message. And so Timothy Leary kind of certainly embraced that kind of guru prophet sort of thing. I suspect it has to do with the fact that psychedelics were sort of taken out of Western culture in a large sense. In the 60s, saw this just massive influx very, very quickly into a culture that didn't have cultural institutions and didn't have a framework around psychedelics. Whereas, usually in ancient contexts and indigenous contexts, they've been used for thousands and thousands of years. And there's sort of there's a ritual and a cultural framework to sort of ground the experience. So that's my take, but that's a really good question that I think we could really spend some time exploring.
Yeah, thank you.
I've never thought about that.
Yeah.
It's kind of unfortunate.
Yeah. And that's one thing that kind of worries me with what we're seeing now too, because there seems to be like this rush in the culture towards psychedelics and all this interest in it, and that's sort of what happened in the 60s. Was like the culture wasn't really ready for it. It was just too much, too fast, and it sort of got out of hand. And I don't think we'd see the 60s happen again, but I do sort of worry that things are happening a little too fast and the culture is not quite ready for it. And so I could see it going sort of haywire in a number of different ways.
This is kind of switching topics, but I was really curious about the researchers that you interview, and they seem very willing and enthusiastic about their work. What did you run into, like a spectrum of reactions, or were people pretty happy to be interviewed?
Yeah, in the beginning, it was really, really difficult actually. So I sort of I wanted to do this project on, start filming with the NYU research team. And I actually put together this whole proposal and had meetings with them, sort of pitched the idea. And then they actually said no originally. And I was sort of months into the process. And I was also under the illusion that this was going to be my senior thesis film, which never even came close. But so it was really a moment of panic where suddenly they said no, because they were really worried about how the study was going to be portrayed. And especially back then, there was not as much press coverage. So they were really, really wary about sort of giving access to somebody that they didn't know. So then I reached out to the Hopkins team, and Matt Johnson gave me an interview from him. He was one of the first people to agree to an interview. And I went out and filmed enough that I could go back to the NYU team and say, oh, I interviewed so-and-so and so-and-so. And then eventually they did give me access. And then we've since become quite good friends, and they're really big fans of the film, and we stay in touch and everything. But that was definitely, there was a hurdle to cross that for sure. And then the next big hurdle was getting the participant interviews as well, because once I interviewed the researchers, I said, can I interview some of the people that went through the study? Because we need to get the first person account of what their experience was. And they said no. They were like, nope, we do not allow press people to interview our participants. And I was like, oh no, that was a really big problem, because I felt like it'd be really hard to talk about this study without getting that first person perspective. And then it was a couple of years down the road where eventually they said there's somebody, and she just went through the program and she had such an amazing experience. We feel we need to document it for posterity. So if you can travel up to Rochester, New York, and then we'll let you interview her. And that was really the first one I did, and then that opened the door for more. So it was many years of that. But that's also a reflection, I think, of the time and how sort of these researchers, because they were really afraid of the 60s happening all over again. And so they were really, really careful about kind of who they let in terms of press and media.
That makes sense. We have 2 questions in the chat. Amy said, could you talk more about American culture not being ready for psychedelics? What would a ready culture look like? Is there a current culture you think is using psychedelics in a way that that seems more permanent or sustainable?
Yeah, so like, you know, when you look at psychedelic use indigenously, right, in Central and South America, for instance, that goes back at least a couple thousand years. They think for sure at least 2,000 or 3,000 years, but probably much longer than that. Another interesting ancient use of psychedelics is actually in ancient Greece. So there was this thing called the Eleusinian Mysteries, and it was sort of this mystery ceremony that took place in Eleusis in ancient Greece. And all the major figures from ancient Greece participated in this sort of secret ritual, like Plato, Socrates, Pythagoras. And they never knew quite what was in the mysteries, but it was this thing that you went to and you participated in, and you were supposed to learn the great secrets of life, like the mystery of life and death and what our purpose is here on Earth. And there's quite good evidence that what they were actually drinking was a potion based on ergot derivatives, which is what LSD is derived from. So it was an LSD-like potion called the Kukion. And there's a great book called The Immortality Key that came out recently that's all about this history. And that went on, I believe, for 1,000 years. So a very long time. But in ancient Greece, you were forbidden from speaking about what you experienced in this mystery, actually under punishment of death. So if you spoke about what happened at the mysteries, you could be executed. And then there was one fellow who took this potion outside the mysteries and brought it to his home, and was apparently like giving people the sacrament at home, and then he was banished from ancient Greece. So there's always been like it's always treated as a very sacred thing, and there's always a lot of control around how people are taking it, and there's a lot of emphasis put on the context, the preparation, the integration afterwards. And I just think there's just that wealth of knowledge when you look at the ancient use and indigenous use that just goes back so long that I think there's a lot of wisdom there about how to do the experience right. And also too, these are plants found in nature. They're not like run by for-profit companies, or they're not retreat centers. And so I think that's another tricky issue, that when you introduce, a for-profit business, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but that can get kind of ugly, and whether people have the right intentions or not, and whether it's treated as a sacrament. Like that's really the biggest thing I want people to take away from the film, is like these experiences can be profound and can be transformational, but it's all about the context in which you take it. So they can be incredibly therapeutic, or people can end up in hospital rooms and they can have, really traumatic experiences. So that's kind of my fear with sort of American culture, Western culture, embracing these at the speed with which they are.
Yeah, that's interesting. I thought that was interesting that Hoffman, one of the last things he says in the film is referencing back to that. We have a question from Nick. This might have been in the film, and I may have missed it, but after Gordon Wasson went to Mexico and discovered psilocybin mushrooms, how did they discover that the psilocybin was the psychoactive element?
Yeah, so after he had this experience, they really wanted to figure out like what is in these mushrooms that brings about this crazy psychoactive effect. So they brought samples of the mushrooms to Albert Hofmann, because Albert Hofmann had synthesized LSD by accident about 20 years before that. And it was actually Albert Hofmann who ended up figuring out that psilocybin is the active compound in the mushrooms. And I believe he did that actually through a process of self-experimentation, on experimenting these various compounds on himself. And then there's an interesting story, going back to the question about mushrooms versus psilocybin itself. There's a story where then they they brought samples of psilocybin to Maria Sabina, who's the curandera who gave Gordon Wasson the mushrooms in the first place. And she's reported to have said that the spirit is in the pill, so that, you know, even though it's in pill form, the spirit is continuing on. But yeah, so it was Albert Hoffman who synthesized it.
Wow, that's interesting. Nick says thanks, and Amy said great insight on the last question about what would a ready culture look like. Was there anything else that you were hoping people would get out of the film? I think the context, you kind of hinted at that with like establishing a context, establishing preparation and complexity, rather than, you know, this is a product that's going to make life better.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing I think, I mean, where I see this having like a lot of promise potentially is I'm very interested in this idea of breaking down boundaries. So like, you know, our minds sort of have this story that we tell ourselves about who we are and about who other people are. And we tend to view the world as separate from ourselves. And in a lot of ways, that's how like mankind evolved to dominate the planet like we have, you know, is through dominating other species, killing each other. But I just, the planet and the species are like reaching this breaking point, in my opinion, where we pretty much trash the environment and we can't keep living like this. We can't keep treating the environment the way that we just won't survive. And the human species seems to be going crazy at the same time. You know, the political polarization and people beating up stewardesses on flights, like there seems to be this sort of collective kind of madness. And so I see it, those two things sort of reaching this sort of breaking point. And so my hope is that this experience of sort of unity, of oneness, of connection with the planet, connection with each other, can hopefully be really what saves us. So it's a big idea, but that's another theme I wanted to kind of throw in there.
Thank you. If anyone has any other questions, feel free to unmute yourself. Well, I really appreciate you making the film. I work in mental health, so I was kind of always coming at it from that, psychedelics, the concept, and from that and lens. So it's, I think, an interesting job to have to be a historian about it, or, you know, in the way the film ended up. There's a lot of complexity and a lot of ways you could come at it. There is a question, 2 questions, and a couple of people saying thanks. Will this film be available on a streaming service?
Yeah, so I recently partnered with a distribution company. And so they're in the process of basically pitching the film to various streaming platforms. So hopefully we'll see, we're just beginning that process, but hopefully at some point next year, it will be available either on like a Netflix type streaming platform or on a sort of pay-per-view type platform like iTunes or Amazon, one of those. So hopefully we'll have an announcement about that in the coming months.
Thank you. And then from Tatiana, in the Fantastic Mushrooms movie, Fantastic Fungi, it was mentioned that PTSD can be helped with only 1 dose, and that there is not a whole lot of money to be made because of that. Maybe it will never take off, question mark.
Yeah, that's the funny thing, or the interesting thing. Like, for instance, one of the participants in the NYU study who I interviewed, Estlin Walkoff, she was actually the first person I interviewed. I interviewed her in 2014, right after she had completed the study. And I keep in touch with her, and she actually participated in a different virtual event almost a year ago. And that experience that she had was so profound that she still talks about it, and as if it impacts her life today. Yeah, and I know in the Hopkins study, I believe 70% in one study said that their psilocybin experience was like the top 3 most significant experiences of their life. So they put it up there with like the birth of a child or the death of a parent. So these are definitely seem to be very lasting experiences that people do take through their whole life. And interestingly, going back to that, the Eleusinian mysteries, you actually only drank this potion and participated in this thing one time. You were actually only allowed to participate one time. So I definitely do agree that these are kind of like a one dose thing, which is a terrible business because you want repeat customers. But I think that's one of the tricky, one of the things that I worry about when you introduce sort of the for-profit model into this, because I don't see a lot of compatibility between these experiences and maximizing profitability. And so that's I think a sense of worry for me. That's exactly why, really, because if you're a business and you want to give people and your purpose is profit, you want people coming back for more. You don't want like to heal somebody and then now they're good.
That's interesting, and kind of in the context of like microdosing or the conversation around microdosing, it's been presented as like a performance enhancement for students or coders or things like boost your productivity. And like, I think that's probably, I don't know, but it's probably also like an American phenomenon of like trying to make that not spiritual at all, but like enhance your work.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
So interesting. Yeah, it's definitely like a craze or maybe not a craze, but a trend in Silicon Valley, among like CEOs, like high performing CEOs. And that's another weird thing, because I never went into microdosing in the movie, because I was more interested in the spiritual experience. But the microdosing trend just happened like 2 or 3 years ago. So I get a lot of questions about microdosing, and I don't know a ton about it because I didn't really cover it in the film. So yeah, that's been another really surprising or interesting trend. And also I know some people are looking into actually removing the psychedelic component of like psilocybin or magic mushrooms, and to see if that can still have a therapeutic benefit. I know that's one of these things that these companies are looking at. And I know the researchers say, no, that's ridiculous. The whole point of it is the spiritual experience. But that's another way of sort of, making things quicker or more profitable.
That's interesting. And we're seeing that with other entheogenics and mushrooms, and like we don't even know what's in it, but it's becoming popular regardless. Mm-hmm. Amy said, can't wait to see your multi-part series on psychedelics. Great work on this doc. Thank you. Could you mention more books that guided your research? You did say The Immortality Key by Brian.
Morescu.
I don't know. Anything else you'd suggest? I'm interested in Indigenous histories / traditions.
Yeah, a lot of good ones. Acid Dreams was one of the first ones I read. And that's about the CIA, a lot about the CIA and their use of LSD in the 60s. Storming Heaven by Jay Stevens, another great sort of history of psychedelics in America. Great book by Albert Hoffman, who discovered LSD and synthesized psilocybin. And that's LSD, My Problem Child. And that's sort of his personal memoir and also all about his psychedelic experiences. And then How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan is quite good. And he goes into a lot of the indigenous history and tradition. And then there's another book, which I've actually never read, called Plant of the Gods. And I know that one's referenced all the time, so I definitely check out that one as well. Because I believe the Aztec name for magic mushrooms translates to plant of the gods, flesh of the gods. And there's a lot of painting from the Aztecs sort of depicts like a mushroom, and then a man eating that mushroom, and then a deity sort of coming through the mushroom. So yeah, Food of the Gods is another one I'd recommend.
And do you plan to revisit this in your work at all as a filmmaker or editor, anything in the film realm?
Yeah, I definitely think that I've just spent so much time in this subject, and now there's so much interest in it, way more than when I started, that I do think I'd owe at least one more project in the subject. So I'm thinking about, like I talked about, doing that series, breaking the whole history out into multiple series. That's sort of one idea. I was also considering doing actually doing it in podcast form, which is a little bit easier to put together than a whole film. And then also to just potentially doing like more short form content for some of these people, like particularly MAPS is an organization, I think, that's doing really good work. And they're mainly focused on MDMA, but so I'm thinking about doing something sort of about MDMA and the studies with PTSD, because that whole thing is much further along than psilocybin. I think that's a really interesting case to look at.
Wow.
Yeah, because those are in phase 3 trials right now, and they expect that MDMA will be rescheduled by 2023.
Why was that? Do you know?
It's just further along in the research. So psilocybin, quite certain, is still in phase 2 trials, and they've created, so there's this thing called data exclusivity. So if you're the one who funds research, you actually have exclusivity over that data for 5 years. So MAPS created what's called the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation. And it's kind of a mix between a nonprofit and a corporation. So the idea is that it's benefiting, it's prioritizing maximum public benefit as opposed to profit. And they're actually going to be the ones really in charge of administering MDMA therapy for the first 5 years once it gets rescheduled. Because MAPS has really been the one behind all of the research with MDMA and PTSD. So that's super. And I don't really know as much about MDMA because I didn't really cover it in the film. So that's kind of another idea I'm kind of toying around with, and maybe potentially timing it with that rescheduling.
Oh, that'd be interesting.
Yeah, which would be much faster than it took me to make this one, but.
I think that's everything from the chat. We'll just, if anyone has any last questions, otherwise we'll let you go. But thank you so much again. It was totally different experience to be able to ask about the film. So I'm glad we were able to see it before it was distributed.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And then do you mind if I put the link to my newsletter and stuff?
Yeah, thanks for reminding me. So Pat's going to put a few things in the chat about supporting his work and his newsletter. So I'm going to leave that up.
Great. Yes, that first link is the newsletter sign up. So I'll be making any updates, like including hopefully an announcement about it being available on a streaming service. I pretty much do everything through the newsletter. And then that second link is just a donation button that'll just go towards me as an independent producer to getting this film in front of more audiences.
How often does your newsletter come out?
Once a month, usually. Cool. Yeah. Sometimes I miss a month, but it's usually about once a month. And then I also try to include some cool stuff about psychedelic research, like latest news or some cool, stuff I find on YouTube and that sort of thing.
Great. And again, we'll post this Q&A on the utahmushrooms.org website on the blog if you missed it. We also have a link for 30 days. Since it's not distributed, we're not just going to post that. But if you know somebody who wasn't able to make it tonight, who would be really interested in this film, will be able to access it for 30 days from today, I think. So thanks again, Pat. I'll just be here. I'm going to copy some of these links. But it's a treat.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, thank you everybody for coming too.
Good luck on your future work.
Thank you.